My name is Serena Marsh. I am 27 years old. And on the Saturday afternoon, I announced my pregnancy to my family at a backyard gathering with 31 people watching. My mother looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Lord, another mouth we will have to worry about." My father did not even put down his fork. He simply exhaled and said, "You have always been a problem, Serena. Now you are making more problems." 31 people, aunts, uncles, my grandmother in her lawn chair, neighbors from 3 houses down, my father's co-worker and his wife who had brought a fruit tray. All of them heard every word. A few of them looked at their shoes. Nobody spoke. I smiled. I said, "Excuse me for a second." And I walked to the drink table, poured myself a glass of lemonade, and stood there quietly for a moment looking at the backyard I had grown up in. I was not embarrassed. I was not fighting tears. I was not calculating whether to scream or to leave. I was thinking about the phone call I had made that morning, 3 hours before I drove to their house, the call that had already changed everything, even if no one at that cookout knew it yet. My parents had called my unborn child a burden in front of 31 people. What they did not know was that I had been paying every single bill that kept their life running for the past 4 years. Past tense. Before you understand the revenge, you have to understand the love. Because there was real love once. And that is what makes this story hurt in the places it does. I grew up in Maplewood, a mid-sized town in Ohio that felt smaller than it was because everyone in it seemed to know your business before you did. My parents, Raymond and Gloria Marsh, were respected in the way that people become respected when they present well and complain loudly. They were involved in the church, friendly to neighbors, and completely different behind their own front door. I want to be careful here, because I am not trying to paint a picture that erases every good memory. My father taught me to ride a bike on a Sunday morning when I was 6, and I remember laughing so hard I fell into the grass. My mother made a specific kind of banana bread on rainy afternoons that I have never been able to recreate. Those things were real. Those things happened. And for a long time, I held on to them harder than I held on to anything else. But the other things happened too. I was the only child. My parents had wanted more, and the fact that more never came was something that seemed, over time, to have been redirected into the way they treated me. Not through cruelty, exactly, through a particular brand of dismissal, a constant low-grade signal that I was something they were managing rather than raising. I was a responsibility, a line item, a fact of their life that required maintenance. I heard the phrase, "You are lucky we provide for you," so often that by the time I was 14, I had stopped hearing it as a sentence and started hearing it as background noise. The same way you stop hearing a refrigerator hum. I left for college at 18, which they made clear was a betrayal. Not because they wanted me there for emotional reasons, because my leaving disrupted something they had already planned around my presence. I did not fully understand that at the time. I just knew that the week before I left, my mother told me that most people who went off to do their own thing ended up regretting it. I did not regret it. I studied accounting. I was disciplined, focused, and driven in the specific way that people are driven when they are trying to prove something to someone who has told them not to bother. I graduated with honors and took a position at a financial consulting firm in Columbus. The first time my parents asked me for money, I was 23. My father had lost a client through his small landscaping business, and the mortgage payment for the month was $300 short. He called me at 7 in the morning, and the conversation was brief. He said they were short. He said I had a real job now. He said it would be paid back. I sent the $300 that afternoon. Not because I believed it would be paid back, because they were my parents. And in spite of everything, I loved them in the complicated, stubborn way that you love people who raised you, even when the raising was imperfect, even when the love they gave back was conditional and uneven. That was the first payment. Over the following 4 years, I made 112 more. I was meticulous about tracking them, not because I planned to demand repayment. I tracked them because I was an accountant, and tracking money is what accountants do, even when the money is personal. I recorded every transfer, every Venmo payment, every cash handoff at Sunday dinners. I kept the screenshots. I kept the bank statements. I kept the text messages where my father said thanks, and my mother said, "We really appreciate this, Serena." By the time I was sitting at that backyard cookout, listening to my mother describe my unborn child as something to worry about, I had transferred a total of $41,680 to my parents across 4 years. Not once had either of them, in any conversation with any family member, mentioned where their bills were being paid from. Not once. And that, as I would soon discover, was the smallest part of what they had been hiding. When you support someone financially, you assume the money goes where you are told it goes. You assume a certain basic honesty. That assumption, I would learn, had cost me far more than $40,000. My parents told the family that they were doing fine, not just fine. Well, this is the part of the story that did not become clear to me all at once. It came together gradually, the way a mosaic does, one small tile at a time, over the course of about 6 months before the cookout. It started with a conversation at my cousin Deborah's birthday dinner in November. I was seated next to my Aunt Patrice, my mother's older sister, and we were talking idly about family finances in the way that Midwestern relatives do at dinner tables when there is nothing particularly pressing to discuss. Aunt Patrice mentioned, without any apparent awareness of how it would land, that she was glad my parents seemed to have gotten their finances sorted in recent years. She said she had worried about them for a while when my father's business slowed down, but that lately they seemed to be in a very stable place. She mentioned that my mother had told her the landscaping business had picked up significantly and that Raymond had landed some corporate contracts. I set down my fork very carefully. The landscaping business had not picked up. I knew this because my father called me every time a bill was due that he could not cover, and those calls had not slowed down at all. In the prior 3 months alone, I had sent money for their water bill, their car insurance renewal, and a medical copay for my father's knee treatment. I asked Aunt Patrice, in the most casual voice I could manage, what my mother had said exactly. She thought about it and recalled that Gloria had described the business as finally thriving and mentioned something about a new truck that Raymond had put a deposit on. I did not know about a truck. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Over the next several weeks, I started paying closer attention. I had a standing invitation to Sunday dinners, and I began accepting them more consistently and listening differently. I was not dramatic about it. I was not snooping. I was simply, finally, paying attention to the gap between what my parents said to me and what they said about themselves to everyone else. The picture that emerged was striking. To the family and to the community, Raymond and Gloria Marsh were a self-sufficient, modestly successful couple who had raised their daughter well and were now enjoying a stable middle age. My father spoke at church events about the importance of financial responsibility. My mother served on the planning committee for the annual community fundraiser. They were, by all outward appearances, the picture of quiet dignity. To me, privately, they were something different. They were people who called when the lights were about to be shut off. People who referenced, casually but pointedly, how much they had sacrificed for me when I was growing up, whenever they sensed I might be hesitating to transfer money. People who had never, in 4 years, offered to discuss a repayment plan, because I do not believe it had ever crossed their minds that I expected one. I began to realize that they were not just receiving my money. They were using my money to maintain a public image that made them look independent while being entirely dependent on me. And they were doing it without a word of acknowledgement to anyone, without a single conversation in which they said to a family member, Serena has been carrying us through a hard time, and we are grateful. Instead, I had heard my mother tell my aunt that I was still finding my footing professionally. She had told my grandmother that I worked hard but struggled with direction. She had described my relationship with my long-term partner, Marcus, as unstable. I was funding their dignity while they were quietly dismantling mine. I was not angry yet. Anger was too simple for what I was feeling. I was assembling a plan. There are moments in your life that are so purely yours that the rest of the world feels irrelevant for a few beautiful minutes. Finding out I was pregnant was one of those moments. What happened next made sure it did not stay that way. I found out on a Wednesday morning in late March. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years, living together for one. He was a structural engineer, steady and thoughtful, and the kind of person who does not say a thing unless he means it. We had talked about children in the abstract, in the way that couples in their mid-20s do when the future still feels like a comfortable distance away. Neither of us had made a formal decision in either direction. I took the test alone before Marcus woke up. I sat on the bathroom floor for about 20 minutes afterward, just breathing, not panicking, not celebrating, just being very quiet with something very large. When Marcus came into the kitchen and saw my face, he did not ask right away. He made coffee. He set a cup in front of me, and then he sat down across the table and waited. I slid the test across the table. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and he said, "Okay, how do you feel?" Not what do we do? Not are you sure? Just, how do you feel? I told him I felt like I needed a few days to sit with it before I decided how I felt about it. He said that was completely reasonable. He said whatever I needed, he was there. Then he picked up his coffee and we sat in complete silence for another 10 minutes. And it was the most comfortable 10 minutes I had had in a long time. We decided to move forward. We decided together. Across a week of long conversations and one particularly honest dinner where we both said all the things that people are afraid to say out loud about becoming parents. By the end of that week, something had shifted. I was not scared anymore. I was not overwhelmed. I was, quietly and genuinely, excited. I told 2 friends before I told my parents. That was a decision I made consciously. I needed to hear my own joy reflected back to me by people who would celebrate it before I walked it into a room where I was not sure what the response would be. My friend Janelle screamed on the phone. My friend Tariq sent a plant to the apartment the next day with a card that said, "For the new family." I held those responses in my chest like something I could bank against whatever came next. The cookout was my mother's idea. She hosted one every year in June, the same Saturday, the same backyard, the same guest list that had grown up around them over 30 years of neighborhood life. It had always been my mother's favorite event of the year because it was the one day when her world was fully assembled and she was at the center of it. I decided it was the right place to tell them. Not because I thought a public setting would produce a warm reaction, not exactly, but because I had by that point developed enough clarity about my parents to understand that a private announcement would be received, processed, and responded to in private in ways that I had no control over. A public announcement meant witnesses, and witnesses, I had learned, mattered. I also decided it was the right time because of what I had already set in motion. I had spent the 6 weeks prior to that Saturday doing something very deliberate and very careful. I had been building documentation, not for a lawyer, not yet, for myself. A clean, organized, complete financial record of every dollar I had sent my parents across 4 years, with corresponding evidence that those payments had covered specific household expenses while they simultaneously presented themselves to the world as financially independent. The morning of the cookout, I made a phone call. After that call, I drove to my parents' house. And when my mother called my unborn child something I will not repeat without flinching, I was already standing on the other side of a decision that could not be undone. People ask me sometimes why I did not just cut them off quietly, without the confrontation, without the gathering, without any of it. The answer is simple. Quiet exits are for people who have been treated quietly. What was done to me was not done quietly. I woke up at 5:45 on the morning of the cookout. Marcus was still asleep. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the folder I had been building for 6 weeks. I want to be transparent about what was in that folder, because this is the part of the story that requires precision. There were 47 pages of documentation. Bank transfer records showing every payment I had made to my parents since I was 23. Text message screenshots in which my father or mother had explicitly told me what the money was for: the mortgage, the utilities, the car insurance, the grocery run when the account was low. There were 3 voice messages I had saved, not because I was planning something at the time, but because I am a person who does not delete things. And in those voicemails, my mother had described, in her own voice, specific financial situations that she had since told other family members did not exist. There was also a printed copy of my mother's Facebook page, going back 2 years, which I had screenshotted in sections. On that page, there were photographs of the house with new patio furniture. A post about a weekend trip she and my father had taken to visit friends in Indiana. A comment she had left on a neighbor's post saying, "Raymond and I are just blessed. We have everything we need." That post had been made 11 days after she had called me to ask for money for a heating repair. I also had a folder within the folder. This one I had compiled not through my own records, but through careful conversations over the preceding weeks. I had spoken to Aunt Patrice twice more since the birthday dinner. I had spoken to my father's brother, Uncle Len, who was on the guest list for the cookout and who had revealed in the course of a casual conversation that my mother had told him I was not doing well emotionally and had always needed a lot of support. Uncle Len had said it with kindness, the way you mention something you believe to be true, the way you might say someone is left-handed or afraid of dogs. He had believed her. Why would he not believe her? The phone call I made at 7:30 that morning was to my bank. I had set up an automatic monthly transfer to my parents' joint account 3 years prior. It had started as an irregular arrangement and formalized over time into a scheduled payment. It was not a large amount by itself, but it was consistent and had become, I suspected, something they had stopped treating as supplemental income and started treating as a guaranteed line in their budget. I called the bank, and I canceled the transfer permanently. I also called the utility company that managed my parents' electricity account, to which I had been listed as an authorized third-party payer for the past 2 years. I removed myself from that account. I did the same with the internet service account, which was in my father's name, but which I had been paying directly through an online billing portal they had shared with me during a period when my father had said he was having trouble navigating the website. By 8:15 that morning, every financial thread connecting me to my parents' household had been cleanly severed. I closed the folder. I got dressed. I drove to Maplewood. And I sat at my mother's cookout in the late afternoon sun, surrounded by 31 people who had heard 2 decades of carefully curated stories about the Marsh family, and I announced my pregnancy with a smile on my face. What happened next, the words my parents said in front of those 31 people, hurt. I will not pretend otherwise. Even when you are prepared, even when you have already made your move, cruelty from a parent lands somewhere tender. But it also sealed something. It made everything I had done that morning feel not just justified, it made it feel necessary. There is something that happens in a crowd when someone says something unforgivable out loud. The silence is not neutral. It is the sound of 31 people deciding who they are. I stood at the drink table for about 3 minutes after my mother's comment. I could feel the 31 people behind me recalibrating, the kind of recalibration that happens after something lands wrong in a group setting, chairs shifting, someone coughing. My cousin Devra, who was closest to me, had gone completely still. When I turned back around and walked to my seat, I did not look at my parents. I looked at the table, at my plate, at the glass in my hand. I was composed in a way that I recognized was being noticed, because the composure was out of place. Most people, when spoken to that way, react visibly. I did not react. I sat down, picked up my fork, and resumed eating. My father, who had barely participated in the original exchange, said nothing further. He became deeply interested in his corn. My mother said to nobody in particular, in a lighter tone designed to reset the air, "Well, I am sure it will all work out." The way people say things that are not apologies but are intended to function as them. The moment passed. Conversations restarted around the tables. Music was playing from the speaker near the back fence. Children were running near the yard's edge. The cookout continued. But it did not continue the same. Aunt Patrice came and stood beside me quietly at the buffet table about 20 minutes later, under the pretense of getting more potato salad. She did not say anything dramatic. She just placed her hand briefly on my arm and said, "You are going to be a wonderful mother." She said it in a voice that was steady and deliberate, the kind of voice that is meant to be a counterweight to something specific. Uncle Len came by later and clapped me on the shoulder and said congratulations, loud enough that my father heard it across the yard. I caught the look on my father's face when Len did that. Something complicated moved through it. Not shame, exactly. Something closer to awareness. My friend Tariq's girlfriend, Alicia, who had been invited as part of a larger friend group I had folded into the cookout list, found me near the edge of the yard late in the afternoon and said quietly, "What your mother said was not okay." I told her I knew. She hugged me once, and then we talked about something else entirely, which was what I needed. By the time the cookout began to wind down and people started loading food into containers and collecting children, something in the room had shifted in ways that my parents had not fully tracked. They were good at performing normalcy. They had been doing it for 30 years. They moved through the cleanup and the goodbyes with practiced warmth, hugging aunts, shaking hands, sending people off with foil-wrapped plates. They believed the afternoon had been, on balance, fine. A small moment, absorbed and moved past. Serena had reacted well. No scene, no drama, everything contained. They did not know what Aunt Patrice had texted her daughter on the way to her car. They did not know what Uncle Len had said to my father's brother later that evening on the phone. They did not know what Devra had done the moment she got home, which was to call her mother and describe, in full detail and with visible distress, exactly what she had witnessed that afternoon. They did not know any of it. And they definitely did not know what was going to happen when they sat down the following Tuesday morning to review their monthly finances and discovered that the automatic transfer from my account had not arrived, because it had been due the previous Monday, and for the first time in 3 years, it was not there. My father would call me twice before noon. My mother would call 4 times. I did not answer any of them. There is a specific power in not answering a phone. Not because silence is passive, but because when the person calling has taken your silence for granted for years, suddenly not getting an answer is the loudest thing they have ever heard. I watched my phone on Tuesday morning with the same focused attention I brought to financial reports at work. Each call came in, lit up the screen, and rolled to voicemail. My father at 9:12, my mother at 10:05, my father again at 10:48, my mother twice between 11 and noon. I did not listen to the voicemails, not yet. I had decided I would not listen until I was ready to respond, and I was not ready yet. I told Marcus what was happening in careful detail over dinner that evening. He had known pieces of the story since we had been together, but not the full picture. I had protected him from the full picture the same way I had protected everyone else, which I now recognized was part of how the situation had been allowed to run as long as it had. I was a person who managed things quietly, and managing things quietly had allowed my parents to remain comfortable while I absorbed the cost. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been carrying this alone for a long time." It was not a question. I told him he was right. He said, "What do you need from me right now?" I told him I needed him to trust that I knew what I was doing. He said without hesitation that he did. On Wednesday, I listened to the voicemails. My father's first one was businesslike. He said he had noticed the transfer had not come through and assumed it might be a bank issue. He left his account number, as though I might have forgotten it, and asked me to check on it when I had a chance. His second one was less businesslike. He said it had been 2 days and the mortgage was coming out that Friday, and he needed to know what was happening. My mother's first message was warmer in tone but unmistakable in content. She said she was just checking in, that she hoped I was feeling okay given the pregnancy, and that if I could look into the payment situation, it would be a big help. Her second and third were progressively shorter. Her fourth message was the one that told me everything I needed to know about where they thought they stood with me. She said, "Serena, this is not the time for whatever this is. We are your family. You do not walk away from family." I played that one twice. You do not walk away from family. 4 years. $41,000. An unborn child called a burden in front of 31 people. And the conclusion she had arrived at was that I was walking away from family. I called my cousin Deborah that evening, not to vent, to ask her something specific. I asked her, carefully and directly, whether she had heard my parents describe their financial situation to anyone in the family over the past year or two, and, if so, how they had described it. Deborah was quiet for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "Serena, your mom told half the family that you had been going through a rough patch at work, and that they had been helping you out financially." I sat down slowly. She kept talking. She said my mother had mentioned it at Christmas as context for why I had not given a large gift. She had said it to Aunt Patrice's husband in passing once. She had apparently told one of the neighbor women, who had relayed it to another neighbor, that Raymond and Gloria had been quietly supporting their daughter for years because young people today had a harder time getting stable. They had not only accepted my money without acknowledgement, they had told people they were giving it to me. I put the phone down and looked at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my documentation folder and I started adding to it. By Friday of that week, the calls had become something different. Less confused, more demanding. That is the moment when a person who has been receiving something without accountability finally understands that the arrangement is over and the mask comes off. My father called at 8:40 Friday morning. I answered. He did not open with hello. He opened with, "What is going on with the account, Serena?" Not a question, a statement of displeasure. The voice he used when I was in high school and had done something inconvenient. I told him clearly and without emotion that I had canceled the automatic transfer. I told him I had also removed myself as a third-party payer on the utility accounts. There was a pause. Then he said, "You canceled it." I said yes. He said, "Because of what happened at the cookout." I said not only because of that, but that what happened at the cookout had confirmed something I had been thinking about for several months. He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence I heard him doing what my father always did when something surprised him, regrouping, restructuring, finding the angle that returned him to a position of authority. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to something more measured. He said, "Serena, we have been managing a difficult period. You know that. The business has had setbacks. We are not asking for charity. We have always intended to return what you have provided." I told him I had documentation of every transfer I had ever made to him and my mother. I told him the total was $41,680. I told him that I did not say this expecting repayment. I said it because I wanted him to understand that I had been paying attention. Another pause. Then he said, "That number is exaggerated." I told him I had bank records. payment confirmations, and text messages in which he and my mother had explicitly described what each payment was for. I told him I had kept everything. The quality of the silence on his end changed. I continued. I told him I was also aware that at least 3 family members had been told by my mother that she and my father had been financially supporting me. I told him I found that interesting, given the bank records. He said, that was taken out of context. I asked him what context would make that an accurate statement. He did not answer that question. Instead, he changed direction entirely and said that whatever issues I had with how information had been shared, this was not the time to be making financial decisions that would affect the whole family. He said I was pregnant and under stress, and that emotions should not drive choices like this. I told him my emotions were not driving this choice. My spreadsheet was. He said, Serena, in the tone parents use when they have run out of strategies and are falling back on authority. I told him I loved him. I said it calmly, and I meant it in the complicated, painful way that I had always meant it. Then I told him that loving someone and continuing to fund a version of reality that hurt me were 2 different things. I told him the transfers were not coming back. I told him the utility accounts were closed, and I told him that what happened next was going to depend largely on what he and my mother chose to do with the information they had just received. He hung up. My mother called 20 minutes later. I did not answer. I let the call go to voicemail, and then I set the phone face down and went to work. That afternoon, I received a text from Aunt Patrice. It said simply, Raymond called Len this morning. He said you are having a breakdown because of the pregnancy. Are you okay? I read that message 3 times. I read that message 3 times. Then I made 2 decisions. The first was to call Aunt Patrice back. The second was to send her the folder. The most powerful thing about the truth is that it does not need your help once you release it. It finds every corner on its own. I called Aunt Patrice from my car during my lunch break. I had thought carefully about how to have this conversation. I did not want to be performative. I did not want to weaponize information for the sake of spectacle. But I also understood, with complete clarity, that my parents had spent years managing the family's perception of me, and that silence on my part was no longer a neutral act. Silence, in this context, was consent for the narrative to continue. I told Patrice I was not having a breakdown. I told her I had made a deliberate financial decision. Then I told her why. I did not dramatize it. I gave her facts. I told her the total amount I had transferred over 4 years. I told her what the money had been used for. I told her what my father had told me about the mortgage being at risk. I told her what my mother had apparently told her, and Len and others about their financial situation. I told her what Devra had told me about my mother's story regarding who was supporting whom. Patrice listened without interrupting, which is not something she typically does. She is a woman who speaks her mind quickly and often. Her silence told me more than any words she could have offered. When I finished, she said, Serena, how long have you known all of this? I told her I had begun to piece it together about 6 months ago and had been documenting since then. She asked me whether I had physical documentation. I told her I did. She asked whether I was willing to share it with her. I thought about it for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be honest with myself about why I was doing this. It was not for revenge in the theatrical sense. It was not to humiliate my parents in the way they had repeatedly humiliated me. It was because a family had been operating on a false narrative for years, and I was no longer willing to be the silent center of that fiction. I sent her the folder that evening. I did not hear from her until the following morning. When she called, her voice was different, tighter. She said she had gone through every page. She said she had shown it to Uncle Len. She said they had both sat with it and agreed that the family needed to have a conversation. That conversation happened the following Sunday, not at my parents' house, at Aunt Patrice's, which she had made clear was a deliberate choice when she sent the invite. My parents were also invited. What they were told was that there was a family matter that needed to be addressed openly. I attended with Marcus. I sat at Patrice's dining room table with 8 family members, including Devra, Uncle Len, 2 of my father's cousins who were close enough to the inner circle to matter, and my grandmother, who was 81 years old and had been given a brief, honest summary by Patrice the evening before. My parents arrived together and sat across from me. My father's expression was unreadable. My mother's was performing calm. Aunt Patrice opened the conversation without preamble. She said that she had received documentation from Serena and that she felt it was important for the people in this room to understand what had been happening. She did not raise her voice. She simply began reading numbers. The table was very quiet. My grandmother, who had not spoken since sitting down, looked at my father when Patrice finished and said, in a voice that carried the full weight of 81 years, "Raymond, you let your daughter carry you, and then you let people believe you were carrying her." My father looked at the table. My mother said, "It is not that simple." My grandmother said, "It is exactly that simple." That was the moment I understood that I would not need to say another word. Accountability does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a table full of quiet people who have stopped pretending. And that silence, that specific silence, is the loudest sound in the world. The 2 weeks following that Sunday dinner were the most turbulent of my family's history and the most peaceful of my own adult life. My father called me on the Monday after the dinner. I answered because I had decided that I was no longer running from conversations. What I was no longer doing was having them on his terms. He opened differently this time. No authority, no restructuring. Just his voice, flatter than I had heard it before, saying, "I want to understand how we got here." I told him we had gotten here because I had been given the message, consistently and over years, that I was a problem to be managed, and I had responded to that message by trying to earn my way into being seen differently, which had been a mistake. I told him that mistake had cost me $41,000 and several years of emotional labor, and that the pregnancy announcement at the cookout had simply been the moment when I stopped being willing to pay any price at all. He was quiet. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Your mother and I have not been honest with the family, or with you." I did not respond immediately. I waited. He said that when the business had struggled, they had both agreed to present stability to the family because they were ashamed of the reality. He said that receiving my money had become something they had normalized, and that the normalization had led them to stop recognizing it as the extraordinary thing it was. He said the story about them supporting me had started as a single comment my mother made to deflect a question from Patrice, and had expanded because no one had challenged it. He did not say it was wrong. He did not say he was sorry, not with those words. But he said it, and I received it as the closest thing to acknowledgement he was capable of in that moment. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I meant it. I also told him it did not change the decisions I had made, and that what happened next in our relationship, if anything, depended on what he and my mother chose to do going forward. The family conversation did not end at Patrice's dining table. Over the following 2 weeks, the people who had been in that room had their own smaller conversations. Len spoke to my father privately and later told me it had been a difficult but honest exchange. Devra called me twice just to check in. The 2 cousins I did not know well both reached out on separate occasions with variations of the same message, that they were sorry they had not asked more questions sooner. My grandmother called me on a Thursday evening. She said 3 things. She said she was proud of me. She said the baby was going to be fine. She said that people who shame their children for growing up had usually been shamed for the same thing once, and that breaking a cycle was the hardest and most important thing a person could do. Then she asked me to name the baby after no one in the family, because fresh starts deserved fresh names. My mother called me in the 3rd week. It was a long call, and parts of it were difficult, and parts of it were genuinely surprising. She said that what she had said at the cookout was wrong. She said it directly, without qualification. And then she did not immediately follow it with a justification. She let it sit. We talked for almost an hour. We did not resolve everything. We did not pretend that 4 years could be undone by one phone call. But we started. Marcus and I moved into our own home that fall, a 2-bedroom with a yard and good light. I painted the second bedroom a soft green. I bought a rocking chair and put it near the window. I did not tell my parents the address for the first 2 months. I needed those 2 months. And I used every single day of them well. My daughter was born in November. We named her Wren. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and when she was placed in my arms for the first time, she looked up at me with the specific focused expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and fully intends to stay. I thought about the word that had been used for her before she was born: burden. I looked at her face, and I thought about that word, and I decided, right there in that hospital room, that she would never hear it. Not once. Not from me. Not from anyone in her orbit if I had any say in it. My parents have met her. The relationship is different now, smaller and more honest and slower than it used to be. That is the right size for what it is. I still have the folder, every page of it, not because I plan to use it again, because I am a person who does not delete things. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. The next story is already waiting, and it is one you will not see coming.